I never expected a simple repair job to change the way I looked at relationships, trust, or myself. But that's exactly what happened. I came to fix a weather-beaten deck on the edge of a quiet, pine-lined street, and left with a story I still haven't fully processed. Because the woman who lived there, quiet, sharp-eyed, and carrying decades of silence, said something to me that stopped time. "You're the first man in 51 years who actually listens." And what followed was a connection neither of us were prepared for. One that would gently unravel secrets, regrets, and unexpected hope over splinters, shared meals, and stargazing nights. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I arrived at her place a little past 8 a.m. Not out of eagerness, but because traffic was thinner than usual, and I had this odd, quiet energy in my gut, like the day was nudging me to get started early. The house sat at the far end of a narrow road with no sidewalk and trees leaning in from both sides, like nature was trying to reclaim the land. A modest single-story home, painted in a faded eggshell white, stood behind a weather-beaten mailbox barely hanging on. There was something about the place that didn't scream neglect so much as forgotten, like it had seen better decades and didn't complain that nobody remembered them. My job was straightforward: repair her deck. The post online said the back structure was collapsing, possibly unsafe, and needed a full overhaul. I'd answered the request because it was local and seemed like a one-week gig at most. Nothing fancy, just the kind of work I liked. Physical, honest, quiet. What I didn't expect was Evelyn. She opened the door before I knocked. I didn't even get my hand to the frame before it creaked open, and there she was, older than I'd imagined, but with a posture that spoke of someone who hadn't let age bend her spirit. Her hair was silver and fell loosely over her shoulders. She wore denim jeans, the knees stained from garden work, and a light gray cardigan that looked hand-knit. Her eyes met mine, steady and unreadable, and for a second, we just stared at each other like we were both sizing up a ghost. Then she smiled faintly, stepped aside, and said, "Back deck's through the kitchen. I put coffee on if you're the type who works better caffeinated." I was still blinking at the suddenness of it all as I stepped inside. The house smelled like lemon oil and something warm, like baked bread that had just left the oven. It was neat, but not staged. There were books on every flat surface, stacked and leaning and marked with scraps of paper. I saw a record player in the corner and a photo of a dog on the mantel. No sign of anyone else, just her. Out back, the deck was in worse shape than I'd expected. Some boards had split clean through, others warped and rising like broken ribs from the frame. Termite, damage on one side, water rot on the other. I crouched and gave a light knock to one of the beams. Soft. This thing would collapse under weight if I didn't get to it soon. I walked the perimeter, mentally mapping what I'd need: wood, brackets, sealant, new railings. It'd take at least a week, maybe more. When I came back inside to ask about measurements and utilities, she was already standing in the kitchen, 2 mugs on the counter. "Black or with cream?" she asked. "Black's fine," I said, and she slid one across. "Name's Evelyn, by the way. I hate when people spend a week working for me and still call me ma'am." I smiled and told her mine. We shook hands. Hers was firm, no tremble. Stronger than I expected. For the rest of that morning, I worked while she drifted in and out. Sometimes I'd catch her watching from the window, other times stepping outside with a towel to wipe down the porch furniture. She didn't hover or make small talk. She just observed, but not with judgment, more like curiosity. Like she was trying to remember how to interact with another person in her space. During lunch, I ate on the steps and she joined me, a plate of cut fruit in her lap. We didn't say much, but she did glance at my hands once and say, "You build things like you've broken them first." It wasn't a question, so I didn't answer. But she wasn't wrong. That stuck with me. By late afternoon, I'd started pulling out the worst boards and laying the groundwork for what would become a new support frame. Evelyn sat inside, reading, and I could see her through the glass door every time I turned. She barely moved, except to flip a page or take a sip from her mug. When I packed up my tools at the end of the day, she walked me out, standing just behind the porch light that hadn't yet flickered on. "You'll be back tomorrow?" she asked. "Early," I said. She nodded once. "You're the first man in 51 years who's actually listened when I speak," she said then, out of nowhere. It hit like a stone tossed in a still lake. I didn't know what to say, so I didn't say anything. She didn't need a response. She just nodded again, a little more to herself this time, and turned inside. I stood there for a few seconds longer, unsure why those words settled into my chest the way they did, like they were meant to stay there. I drove home wondering what kind of silence a person must live through to notice something as small as being heard. The next morning, the sky was heavy with clouds, the kind that held back rain just long enough to make you nervous. I arrived at Evelyn's place with a truck bed full of new lumber, steel joist hangers, and a few extras she hadn't asked for but I figured she'd appreciate: a set of solar deck lights and a weatherproof storage box for her tools. As I backed the truck into the narrow gravel driveway, I noticed her standing at the screen door, arms crossed, wearing the same cardigan as the day before. Her presence was quiet but unmistakable, like the way an old clock ticks in the background, always there, never trying to draw attention, yet impossible not to notice once you're aware of it. I gave her a nod, and she returned it, then disappeared inside as I started unloading the materials. I didn't expect a greeting today. Somehow it felt like we'd already moved past formalities. The work was physical, but I welcomed that. I dismantled the old deck section by section, carefully removing the rusted screws and nails before replacing the beams underneath. I measured and cut new boards, checking every angle twice. My tools buzzed and hummed, but beyond the noise, there was a kind of stillness that made time stretch out. Around mid-morning, Evelyn came outside with 2 paper towels folded neatly over something warm and buttery. "Scones," she said simply, setting them down on the steps. "I always bake when I'm nervous." I raised an eyebrow but didn't pry. She sat on the porch's edge while I ate, her fingers idly tracing the grain in the wood beside her. "The last guy who worked on this place left half the deck undone," she added. "Said he'd be back after the weekend. That was 4 years ago." I nodded, mouth full, not entirely surprised. "He didn't listen either," she said quietly, almost to herself. "Most people don't when there's nothing in it for them." That phrase stuck with me as I kept working. There's a specific loneliness that doesn't come from being alone. It comes from being invisible. That was the kind of energy Evelyn carried. Not the sadness of solitude, but the weariness of being unheard for so long that your words start to taste like dust in your mouth. It made me wonder how many conversations she'd had where no one was really on the other end, how many rooms she'd stood in without ever truly being seen. As I sanded down the new planks and began aligning the frame, I noticed the little touches of life she'd tried to keep going: a chipped bird bath half buried in leaves, wind chimes that hadn't rung in years, a rusted watering can beside a flower bed that hadn't bloomed since Clinton was president. This wasn't just a house. It was a time capsule wrapped in silence. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Later that afternoon, I hit a snag with one of the support beams. The foundation had shifted more than I'd expected, which meant reinforcing the frame would take longer than planned. I explained it to her when she wandered out with fresh lemonade, and instead of frustration, she just nodded. "Things rot when no one cares for them," she said. "Decks, gardens, people. It's not the weather, it's the forgetting." That line hit deeper than it had any right to. I found myself talking more than I usually did on jobs. I told her about my last project, a lake house restoration that turned into a 6-month ordeal because the homeowner kept changing their mind. She laughed, really laughed, and it was rich, full of color, like it had been hiding in her somewhere, just waiting for someone to dig it out. She didn't speak much about herself, but what she said painted pictures: a brother she hadn't seen in years, a dog that used to sleep at her feet, a husband who'd been gone longer than he'd ever stayed. As the sun began its slow descent behind the trees, I packed up for the day. The deck frame was complete, sturdy and level, ready for the planks tomorrow. Evelyn watched from the doorway again, sipping tea this time. Before I left, I turned to her and asked if she had any paint preferences for the final finish. She looked thoughtful, then said, "Whatever you think feels like warmth." It was the kind of answer that could only come from someone who hadn't felt much of that in a long time. I nodded and said I'd bring a few samples in the morning. As I pulled out of the driveway, I glanced back through the mirror. She was still standing there, framed by the soft light of the house behind her. Not waving, not smiling, just present. And that presence lingered in my mind the whole drive home, like a song you can't quite turn off. It occurred to me then that this job was starting to feel like something else, something I hadn't quite named yet, but it wasn't just about wood and nails anymore. It was about showing up. It was about listening. And I had a feeling Evelyn had a lot more to say. The next day, the sky finally cracked open and poured, like it had been holding its breath for a week. I arrived just before the rain started, the air thick with that earthy scent of wet ground and pine. Evelyn greeted me at the door with a knowing look, her arms crossed over a light cardigan, and said, "Well, no deck work today unless you brought a submarine." I chuckled, nodded toward the covered porch, and told her I'd use the time to pre-sand and stain the boards I had stored beneath the tarp. She nodded and stepped aside, letting me work while the sound of rain filled in the silences between us. Every so often she'd appear with tea or a dry rag or just a comment about the news playing faintly from her radio inside. It was a slower kind of day, but not unwelcome. There was something honest about working through the rain, about not letting the storm delay the whole story from unfolding. As I sanded the edges of the longer planks, I caught sight of Evelyn sitting by the window inside, reading something old and worn, maybe a journal or photo album, though I never asked. Her face held a strange blend of nostalgia and detachment, like she was watching memories roll past on a train she didn't ride anymore. Every so often, she'd glance up and meet my eyes through the glass, and neither of us would say a word. It didn't feel like awkwardness. It felt like trust, the kind that didn't need to fill every moment with noise. Eventually, the rain let up just enough for me to move the boards into a drying rack beneath the carport. Evelyn stepped outside again, holding a second cup of tea, and leaned against one of the porch beams beside me. "You ever notice," she said, "how some silences feel heavy and others feel like breathing room?" I nodded, and she added, "This one's the second kind." That led us into a strange, beautiful conversation about her past. Not the kind where someone spills everything, but the kind where little truths trickle out, each one enough to shape a fuller picture. She told me she used to be a nurse, worked nights mostly, and always preferred the calm of late hours when the world slowed down. "Grief shows up a lot at 3 a.m., she said. So does truth. People don't lie when they think it might be their last breath." That stuck with me. She spoke about the patients she'd seen pass, the ones she'd held hands with as they faded, and the way none of them ever talked about money or work. It was always people, she said, almost to herself. People they loved, or wished they'd loved better. I didn't say anything, but it was the kind of story that burrows into your ribs and stays there. Later, she surprised me with an old portable record player she said she found tucked away in the closet. "Do you mind if I play something?" she asked, and I shook my head. She placed a scratched vinyl on the turntable, and soft jazz crackled through the space around us. The sound was rich and imperfect, like it had aged with her. She sat on the porch swing while I continued with my brushwork. And for a while, we didn't talk. We just let the music do the heavy lifting. The porch smelled of fresh cedar and rain, and the wind was starting to cool. It felt like time had slowed down to let the day finish at its own pace. Before I left, I mentioned the paint swatches I'd brought. She looked through them thoughtfully, her fingers grazing each color like she was reading a story in the tones. "This one," she said finally, tapping a shade of deep burnt orange. "It reminds me of those sunrises that look like fire but feel like hope." I smiled and told her I'd get it mixed by morning. As I turned to leave, she reached for my arm, not a grip, just a touch, and said, "You know, you're the first man who's really listened to me in, well, maybe ever." Her voice didn't crack, but the weight of the words did. I looked into her eyes and nodded. "Then I'll keep showing up," I said. not just with tools. She nodded, didn't say anything more, and let me walk away, without needing to fill the silence with anything else. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about her voice when she said it. Not because it flattered me, but because it broke my heart a little. And in a way, made me want to build more than a deck. The next morning brought with it a clear sky, still damp from yesterday's rain, and the early light shimmered off the leaves like everything had been freshly rinsed. I arrived at Evelyn's place with the custom mixed paint she'd picked, burnt orange with just a whisper of sienna, and the boards were dry and ready. She met me with a smile that felt more personal than polite, the kind that says you were thought about after you left. There was coffee waiting again, this time in a tall thermos with a note rubber-banded to the side. Not that machine stuff, I made it myself. Her handwriting was slightly crooked, but there was a grace to it. I poured myself a cup, and got to work, measuring and aligning, drilling and placing each board with intention. I had built dozens of decks over the years, but this one was already different. It had weight beyond the wood and nails, like I was layering in something intangible with each piece I laid down. Something that had to do with her. Evelyn stayed nearby, not hovering but close enough to exchange the occasional thought, question, or half-laughed memory. At one point, she brought out a framed photo, her younger self, late 20s maybe, standing beside a man in army fatigues, both smiling like they hadn't learned the hard parts of life yet. That was him, she said, answering my question before I could ask. His name was Warren. We met at a church fundraiser, fell in love too fast, married faster. He was gone within 6 months. Deployment. Didn't come back. She paused and ran her finger along the edge of the glass. Never remarried. Didn't feel right. I tried dating again, but most of the men they didn't see me. They saw what they needed. A warm meal, someone to clean up after them, a place to unload. Not a partner. Not someone with her own voice. She didn't cry. She didn't even blink more than usual. But that kind of honesty doesn't need theatrics. It lands all on its own. I told her I was sorry. Not as a reflex, but because I truly was. And she nodded like she believed I meant it. The rest of the afternoon was quieter. There were long stretches where only the sound of drilling or the rustle of leaves filled the air. But I noticed something. Evelyn began humming. Soft, not quite a melody I recognized, but it had rhythm and life. She worked beside me for a while, sanding the railing edges, wiping down the posts with a cloth she'd soaked in linseed oil. Her hands were delicate but precise. She didn't rush or fumble. There was something inherently graceful about the way she moved. I realized in that moment I wasn't just building a structure. I was witnessing someone rebuilding themselves, one brushstroke at a time. Not out loud, not in grand declarations, but in small, consistent moments of choosing presence over retreat. Around dusk, as the sun dipped low behind the trees and cast golden light across the porch, we both stepped back to admire the progress. Half the deck had taken shape, solid, clean, warm with its new color. Evelyn stood next to me, holding her tea with both hands, and whispered, "I never thought I'd get excited about wood and nails again. You've made this mean more than I thought it could." I didn't know what to say that wouldn't sound corny or rehearsed, so I just nodded and said, "It's easy to build something when someone wants it to stand." She smiled at that and added, "You know, that's the second time this week you've said something that made me feel seen." And I felt it again. That small pull in my chest, like someone had pressed their palm gently over my heart, not to hurt it, just to remind it that it was still beating. Before I packed up for the day, I asked her if she'd thought about adding a pergola or shade structure above the west side of the deck. The sunset poured directly in, and it could get hot during late afternoons. She considered it and said, "Maybe, but I kind of like feeling it right now. The sun. It's been a while since I let it touch me without rushing away." I understood. Maybe more than I should have. We talked about it a little more. How we both used to rush through moments like that, worried about work or responsibility, or how others might see us. But lately something had shifted. For her, maybe it was age or loss. For me, maybe it was her. I didn't say that last part out loud, not yet. but I carried it with me as I loaded my tools into the truck, looked back at the deck glowing in amber light, and caught her watching me from the porch swing. Not with expectation, but with a quiet kind of gratitude that made everything else in the world feel a little less urgent. The following morning began with the smell of cinnamon again, but this time it wasn't coming from a biscuit. It was from a candle Evelyn had lit in the kitchen window, the faint glow flickering behind the sheer curtains. I didn't ask why, but I took it as a quiet gesture, like maybe she wanted to start the day with something warm already in the air. The deck was coming along beautifully. The planters were framed, the rails were smoothed, and that little corner bench, it had started to feel like a destination, not just an add-on. I arrived a little earlier than usual, tools in hand, and Evelyn greeted me on the porch with a small envelope. No stamps, no address. Just my name, handwritten in looping script. I opened it right there without asking. Inside was a card that read, "You make this place feel alive." That was it. No signature, no explanation. Just that. And yet it stopped me more than any speech would have. We worked mostly in silence that morning. But it wasn't the kind of silence that feels empty. It was full of intention. Like we were both letting something settle inside of us. Every time I looked over, Evelyn seemed lighter. She moved slower, but not with hesitation. More like someone savoring a song they hadn't heard in years. She hummed a little under her breath while potting new flowers to fill the planters we'd just secured. Bright ones, marigolds, petunias, lavender. She had a story for each. "Lavender keeps the mosquitoes away," she said with a smirk, "but also reminds me of my grandmother. She used to tuck it in her sleeves before church so she didn't have to wear perfume." I told her I'd never heard of that, and she winked. "You haven't lived long enough then." It was always like that. Light memories wrapped in wisdom that came from living through the hard parts. Just after lunch, a truck pulled up out front. I saw Evelyn tense slightly, her body shifting like she'd just remembered something unpleasant. A tall man stepped out, mid-50s, maybe older, with broad shoulders and a rigid walk that said military or management. He didn't wave, didn't smile, just made a beeline for the porch like he owned the place. "This is Douglas," Evelyn said flatly before he even reached us. "My brother." Douglas looked at me, then at the half-finished deck, then back at Evelyn. "You've got a stranger rebuilding your house now?" he asked, not bothering to mask the judgment. "He's not a stranger," she replied simply. "He's helping me." Douglas snorted. "You always were too trusting. Look where it got you." The words hung in the air like smoke. I kept quiet, letting Evelyn decide what needed to be said. She didn't flinch. "It got me here," she said. "Alive, independent, and happy, for the first time in a long while." Douglas shook his head and muttered something about finances, inheritance, and doing things properly, before getting back in his truck and driving off without so much as a goodbye. Evelyn didn't cry, didn't sigh. She just stood there, for a moment, hand gripping the railing we'd built together, her knuckles white from the pressure. "He thinks control is love," she said finally. "But I've learned that real love listens. It doesn't bark orders or issue ultimatums." She looked at me then, her eyes soft but steel underneath. "You know what you did that most men never bothered with?" I shook my head. "You let me finish a sentence." We both laughed, though hers was bittersweet. That was Evelyn's strength, being able to laugh at the scar without pretending it never cut her. That evening, as I gathered my tools and wiped down the planks, she brought out 2 glasses of lemonade and joined me on the bench. The sky was starting to tint with orange and lilac, the way it does when the day ends gently. She handed me a notebook, the same one I'd seen her scribbling in before. "There's a poem in there I'd like you to read," she said. I opened to a page marked with a pressed violet. The words were simple, honest. A short piece about building things slowly. Trust, love, peace. It didn't rhyme. It didn't need to. It hit like truth should. Soft, sudden, undeniable. "It's not finished," she whispered. "But then again, maybe that's the point." I closed the book and handed it back with both hands. "It's perfect," I said. And I meant it. That night, as I drove home under a sky smeared with twilight, I kept thinking about the idea of listening, how rare it was, how often people waited for their turn to speak instead of truly hearing what was being said. Evelyn didn't just want help with a deck. She wanted to be understood, to feel seen after decades of being managed, corrected, or ignored. And maybe I was starting to realize that I hadn't come to rebuild something broken. I'd come to witness something still whole. Buried, perhaps, under years of quiet pain, but intact and still beautiful. And witnessing that, being trusted with it, that was more of an honor than any paycheck I could have asked for. The next morning carried the soft hush of a gentle fog hanging low over the trees, the kind that made the world feel like it hadn't quite woken up yet. I arrived a little later than usual, not out of laziness, but because I'd found myself slowing down that morning, taking time with my coffee, standing a little longer in the mirror, wondering if this woman had shifted something in me I hadn't expected. When I pulled up, Evelyn was already out back, barefoot in the grass, wearing an old denim shirt buttoned halfway and rolled up at the sleeves. She was brushing dew off the flower petals with a folded cloth, like she was tending to something sacred. She waved when she saw me, a kind of slow-motion gesture that felt more like a welcome than a hello. As I grabbed my tools, I noticed she'd added a new flower pot to the corner of the deck and painted a small wooden sign that read, "Listening Post." I smiled. It was her way of leaving a breadcrumb trail through the story we were building, one quiet moment at a time. We spent most of the morning working side by side, aligning boards, sanding edges, and fitting the final bolts into the railing. There wasn't much talking, not because there was nothing to say, but because silence had become a sort of language between us. Every once in a while, she'd glance over and hum softly to herself, and I'd catch it like a whisper I didn't want to interrupt. As we worked, I started to notice how well we moved together. She would hand me a screw before I asked, or I'd catch the tape measure just as she let it go. These weren't practiced routines. They were instincts, forming naturally over time. People underestimate that kind of rhythm, the quiet choreography of care. It doesn't shout, it doesn't sparkle, but it stays. It lingers. Around noon, she disappeared inside and came back with a tray. Grilled cheese sandwiches, sliced apples, and 2 iced teas with mint leaves floating like lily pads. We ate on the steps of the deck, our feet brushing the grass, our shoulders nearly touching. At one point she asked, "Do you think people ever really change?" I paused before answering. "I think people remember who they are when someone finally gives them permission to." She looked at me for a long moment, then nodded like she understood something she'd known all along but had finally heard out loud. "That's how I feel around you," she said, almost in a whisper. "Like myself, not the widow, not the sister, not the problem to solve, or the one who stayed too quiet for too long." I didn't know what to say, so I just reached down and handed her another apple slice, and she smiled as if that was exactly the right response. Later in the afternoon, the sun broke through the clouds and scattered golden light across the deck like it was blessing the work we'd done. We stood there admiring it, the new wood shining clean, the railings sturdy, the planters blooming with a riot of color. She turned to me and said, "You gave this place back its dignity." I laughed, brushing sawdust off my jeans. "All I did was build a deck." But she shook her head slowly. "No. You listened to what this house needed, and to what I needed. That's not something you learn from blueprints." Her words landed heavy but warm, like the way a wool blanket feels when it's just been taken out of the dryer. Right before I packed up for the day, she asked if I wanted to walk the property line with her. I hesitated, not because I didn't want to, but because it felt like the kind of thing you did with someone who mattered. But I said yes. We followed a path through tall grass and past a grove of trees where bird feeders swung gently in the breeze. She showed me an old stump where her dog used to sit and a bench her late husband had built decades ago, now weathered and soft at the edges. "He wasn't all bad," she said quietly. "He just stopped trying after a while." And I stopped, asking for what I needed. She ran her hand over the bench's backrest. "It's strange how long you can sit in silence before you realize you've gone missing in your own life." We stood there for a while, not speaking, the wind threading itself around us. When we returned to the deck, the light was beginning to tilt amber again, and Evelyn reached into her pocket and handed me a small object, a smooth, oval stone, painted blue with the word "Stay" etched in black across the surface. "Found this at a craft fair last year," she said. "Never knew what to do with it. But something tells me it's yours now." I turned it over in my palm, feeling its weight. It was heavier than it looked, like it had absorbed meaning over time. "Stay," I repeated. "Stay curious, stay present, stay kind," she said. "Or maybe just stay long enough to matter." I didn't say anything. I just nodded, slipping the stone into my back pocket as if it had always belonged there. That evening, as I drove home, the windows down and the radio low, I realized I was already planning tomorrow. Not just what tools to bring or what final touches the deck needed, but what story I might share with her next. I realized I was listening more. To the birds, to the wind, to my own heartbeat. And maybe that's what Evelyn had meant all along. That when someone really listens to you, not for answers, not for advantage, but simply to understand, you begin to hear yourself more clearly, too. The next few days flowed like a quiet stream, steady and reflective. I found myself arriving at Evelyn's house without needing directions or second-guessing what tools to bring. The project, which had started as just deck repairs, had expanded naturally. Some gutter fixes, repainting the faded trim, and a few flower beds that needed new life. But truthfully, I kept showing up not because the work required it, but because it gave me a reason to linger in her orbit a little longer. There was a rhythm to the way she moved through her mornings now, a calm deliberateness, as if she'd remembered how to take up space again. And I found myself adjusting my pace to match hers, not out of obligation, but because it simply felt right. There was no rush in her presence, no pressure to perform or impress, just two people doing ordinary things in an extraordinary kind of peace. Evelyn started keeping a little journal on the back porch table, one of those worn leather-bound types with a loop for a pen. I noticed she scribbled in it after lunch most days, head bent, eyes soft. I never asked what she wrote, and she never volunteered to show me. But one afternoon, as we sat sipping lemonade in the shade, she slid it toward me and said, "Pick a page." I hesitated at first, unsure if I was stepping across a line, but something in her expression told me it was more invitation than test. I flipped it open somewhere in the middle and read a short entry. It said, "Today, I remembered what sunlight feels like on skin that isn't bracing for something." That single sentence hit me like a wave. It wasn't poetry. It was clarity. I looked up at her, and she just nodded, as if to say, "You see it too, don't you?" After that, the journal became part of our routine. Sometimes she'd read a passage aloud. Sometimes I would. Once I wrote something of my own, just a sentence, and slid it between the pages without telling her. The next morning, she met me at the porch with 2 coffees and that same journal pressed to her chest. "You wrote, 'Listening is a kind of love,'" she said. "I've never thought about it that way." I shrugged, suddenly shy. "It's true, though," she continued. "I think the reason your words matter so much is because they're never loud." That stuck with me all day, maybe forever. I'd spent a lot of my life filling silence with noise, jokes, stories, distractions. With her, silence wasn't something to fix. It was something to honor. That week, we decided to stain the deck together, which meant we both ended up covered in more of the stain than the actual boards. Evelyn laughed more in those hours than I think I'd ever seen her. Not the soft chuckles she usually gave, but full-bodied laughter that shook her shoulders and made her wipe tears from her cheeks. At one point, she dropped her brush entirely and declared, "You're a terrible painter, but I've never had more fun ruining a job." I tossed a rag at her playfully and she ducked, still laughing. There was a weightlessness to that moment, like we were both back in some simpler version of ourselves, before regrets, before losses, before the parts of life that dimmed us. As we cleaned up that afternoon, she looked over at me with this strange mix of hesitation and courage in her eyes. "Can I ask you something?" she said. I nodded. "Do you ever feel like you missed your moment?" The question was so personal, so raw, that I didn't answer right away. I sat down on the deck step beside her and thought for a long second. Yeah, I said. I think I missed a lot of them. But maybe some moments circle back around, disguised as something else. She tilted her head. Like what? Like helping someone stain a deck and realizing it's not about the wood. It's about the person standing next to you, I said. She smiled, but it was the kind that came with a lump in the throat. I've never met anyone who listens like you do, she whispered. You make me feel heard, even when I'm not saying anything. I reached out, not to touch her, but to rest my hand on the stained board between us. Maybe that's what listening really is. Being still, enough to notice what someone doesn't say. That evening, after I packed up and started toward my truck, she called after me. Hey, she said. If you want, there's dinner. It's nothing fancy, just grilled chicken and those garlic potatoes you said you liked. I paused, hand on the truck door, and turned back to her. I'd like that, I said. We ate, on the porch, plates balanced on our knees, the sun dipping low in the sky behind us. The meal wasn't extravagant, but it didn't need to be. It was food shared between people who'd stopped pretending they were strangers. I didn't linger too long afterward, but before I left, she handed me a folded note. Don't open it until you're home, she said. I nodded, pocketing it without question. Later that night, in the quiet of my apartment, I unfolded the note. It wasn't long, just a few words in her neat, careful handwriting. You're the first man in 51 years who actually listens. Thank you for showing me that I still matter. I stared at the paper for a long time, then folded it back up and tucked it into the inside pocket of my tool bag. I knew I'd keep it there for a long while, not because I needed a reminder, but because sometimes the smallest acknowledgments carry the most weight. And hers? It was more than thanks. It was a crack in the armor, a door opening, a whispered promise that maybe, just maybe, some missed moments do come back around. The next morning felt different. Not in the obvious ways, not in the weather or the light, but in that intangible shift that happens when something unspoken has passed between two people. I showed up a little earlier than usual, not because I needed to start the work, but because part of me hoped she'd be on that porch, maybe with that same old journal or a fresh cup of coffee. And there she was, sitting with her legs tucked under her, cardigan sleeves rolled halfway up her arms, looking at the horizon like it owed her something. She didn't seem surprised to see me early. In fact, she smiled like she'd been expecting it, like maybe she'd risen early too, just to wait for the sound of gravel crunching under my tires. That quiet understanding between us had taken root, and now it was growing in all these subtle ways. Timing, eye contact, silence filled with warmth instead of discomfort. I dropped my tool bag on the usual spot and sat next to her without asking. She handed me a mug, still warm, and we sipped in silence for a bit. Did you read it? She asked eventually, and I didn't have to ask what she meant. Yeah, I said. I read it twice. She nodded, then glanced down at her hands, like she wasn't sure what to do with them. I almost didn't write it, she admitted. Felt silly. But then I thought, what's the point of living all these years if I'm still afraid of telling the truth? I looked over at her and said, it wasn't silly. She didn't respond, but her shoulders dropped the tiniest bit, like some invisible tension had finally eased. That day we focused on the last portion of the deck, the far end that had warped, from years of sun and rain and neglect. It was tedious work, pulling old nails, measuring cuts, making sure every board lined up just right. But there was comfort in the repetition, the rhythm of building something with your hands while standing beside someone who didn't need to fill every second with words. At one point, I asked her to hold a plank in place while I drilled, and when our hands accidentally brushed, she didn't pull away. She just looked at me and said, "You're patient. You know that?" I smiled. Or just slow, I joked, and she laughed that same easy laugh that had become one of my favorite sounds. As the afternoon sun climbed higher, she brought out lunch, simple sandwiches and iced tea. We sat on the edge of the deck, legs dangling, sharing bites and stories. She told me about the first time she'd tried to build something on her own, a garden box that ended up more like a lopsided coffin, but one she was proud of anyway. I told her about a shed I'd built for a client that collapsed under its own weight because I'd misread the blueprints. We laughed, but it wasn't just about the stories. It was about the vulnerability tucked inside them. The quiet message that said, "I've failed too, and I'm still here." After lunch, she disappeared inside for a bit, and when she returned, she held something wrapped in an old cloth. She sat beside me, unwrapped it carefully, and revealed a small, hand-carved figurine. It was a woman, standing tall, head slightly tilted upward, arms stretched behind her like wings. "My late husband made it," she said. "Gave it to me on our 10th anniversary. Said it reminded him of how I looked when I danced around the house barefoot, pretending the world didn't exist." I studied the piece. It was rough around the edges, but full of feeling. I could see it, the care that went into every cut. "It's beautiful," I said. She nodded. "It was the last thing he made before his hands started shaking too much to hold a chisel." She paused. "I kept it in a box for years. Couldn't bear to look at it. But now—" She looked at me, eyes full of something tender. "Now I think it's time to let her stand again." I didn't say anything. I just helped her find a place for it, on the new railing, where the evening sun would hit it just right. As we secured the base, she whispered, "Thank you for reminding me who I was before I became invisible." I looked up, startled. "You were never invisible," I said. "You just stopped being seen by the wrong people." She turned to me then, eyes wet but unashamed. "Do you really think so?" I reached for her hand. Not quickly, not forcefully, just enough to show I meant it. "I know so." That evening, as we wrapped up and she walked me to my truck, there was a pause, that kind of moment where something unspoken hovers, waiting to be addressed. She looked at the ground, then at me. "You ever think about staying?" she asked. "Not just today or tomorrow. I mean, not leaving?" The question hung in the air like summer heat. I opened my mouth to respond, but she shook her head, gently, cutting me off. "Don't answer now. I just wanted to say it out loud." And with that, she turned and walked back to the porch. I sat in my truck for a long time before starting the engine. Her words replayed in my mind, so simple, yet so heavy with hope. And though I didn't say anything in return, I knew what the answer would be. I just needed to find the right moment to say it. Because when someone tells you you've made them feel seen after a lifetime of being overlooked, it's not something you walk away from. It's something you honor. Something you grow into. Something you build, one careful board at a time. The following morning arrived with a thick fog rolling low across the grass, the kind that made everything feel still and sacred. I pulled into the drive a little slower than usual, my headlights cutting through the white haze until the shape of the house emerged like a memory returning. The deck, now nearly complete, stood like a quiet promise between us. Something we'd built side by side. A physical record of all the moments that had slowly been threading us together. She wasn't on the porch this time. That absence made my stomach twist a little. I parked, grabbed my tools, and walked around back, only to find her already working, her hands gloved, face smudged with sawdust, measuring a final piece of trim as if she'd been born with a carpenter's square in her hand. She looked up when she heard me, smiled through a strand of hair stuck to her cheek, and said, "I figured you'd be late." I raised an eyebrow. "I'm never late." "You're right," she said, grinning. "You're just dramatic." That banter had become our rhythm, but beneath it, today felt like it carried a different kind of weight. Maybe it was the fog, maybe it was how quickly she turned back to her work, or maybe it was just intuition, but something had shifted. As we worked through the morning, the silence between us wasn't uncomfortable, but it was full. Like both of us were moving through thoughts too heavy to speak aloud. I watched her hammer, watched the way her brow furrowed with focus, and realized something. She was preparing. Not just the deck, not just the home. She was preparing herself, and I didn't yet know what for. When we broke for lunch, she brought out 2 bowls of soup instead of sandwiches and set them on the porch railing. We ate standing, gazing out at the trees, steam curling between us. "You know," she said, after a long silence, "I used to think I was done with chapters." I looked over, waiting. Like all the exciting stuff had already happened. Falling in love, Raising kids, losing someone. That was the story, and everything after was just epilogue. She laughed lightly, but there was no joy in it. Turns out I was wrong. Life doesn't close chapters. We just stop turning the pages sometimes. I nodded slowly, letting her words settle. Some pages are just harder to turn, I offered. Yeah, she said, but it's harder being stuck in the same paragraph forever. She looked at me, then, directly, deeply, and the weight of that gaze made my chest tighten. She was talking about more than just her life. She was talking about us, about whether I would keep showing up, or whether I'd eventually place a period where she still hoped for a comma. I didn't answer. Not yet. I wasn't ready to say the words that had been building, even though I knew I'd say them soon. Instead, I finished my soup, wiped the corner of my mouth with a napkin, and said, "Let's finish this railing." The afternoon passed in a blur of movement. Screws driven, boards sanded, surfaces leveled. The physical labor gave me something to hide inside, a task I could pour my energy into while my mind worked overtime behind the scenes. Every time I glanced at her, though, that sense of preparation returned. She was tidying something. Not just the deck, not just the property. Something inside herself. As if she were preparing to hand it all over and see what I'd do with it. As if she were giving me her trust in small, intentional pieces. When we finally stepped back and looked at the finished deck, she let out a long exhale, like she'd been holding her breath since we started. "It's beautiful," she whispered. And it was. Not perfect. Nothing ever is. But it was strong, honest, and built with care. "So are you," I said before I could stop myself. The words just came, carried out on the same wind that stirred the trees. She didn't reply immediately. She just looked at me, long and searching, and then she said, "Come inside. There's something I want to show you." I followed her in, past the living room, down the hallway, into a room I hadn't seen before. It was filled with boxes, old ones, labeled in faded marker, stacked neatly. She reached for the top box and opened it. Inside were photographs, letters, small trinkets, wrapped in tissue paper. "This," she said, "is the part of me no one's seen in years." She handed me a photo, her as a teenager, laughing with her head thrown back, barefoot in the grass. Then another, her wedding day, a younger version of herself clutching flowers with white knuckles. Then a letter, addressed to her late husband, dated 3 years before he died, never sent. "I kept trying to fix things after he passed," she said, "but I never really let go." She pulled out one last envelope, unsealed, and held it tightly. "This is the letter I wrote to myself the day I turned 50, she said. "Wrote it and tucked it away, told myself I'd read it when I felt ready." I watched as she opened it, unfolded the page with trembling fingers, and read in silence. A tear slid down her cheek, but she didn't wipe it away. After a moment, she handed it to me. The letter wasn't long. It spoke of fear, of being alone, of being invisible, of feeling like her best years were behind her. But it ended with a hope she hadn't yet voiced until now. A hope that someone would see her again, not just as a widow or a mother or a homeowner, but as a woman, still full of life and worth loving. I folded the letter gently and handed it back. "You don't have to hope anymore," I said. "You're seen." Her eyes shimmered, and for once, she didn't speak. She just stepped closer, rested her head against my chest, and let out the softest sigh. In that moment, with the deck behind us and the past laid bare between us, something in both of us settled. Not because everything was solved or decided, but because the distance between who we were and who we might become had finally begun to close. The next morning arrived not with a bang or a shift, but with a quiet consistency that was starting to feel like home. I pulled into the driveway just after sunrise, the dew still clinging to the grass, and for a moment I just sat in the truck and watched the front porch. She wasn't there. Not pacing or sweeping or sipping coffee like she had been most mornings before. And yet somehow that didn't feel wrong. There was a stillness now between us that wasn't distance. It was trust. Like a silent agreement had been made in that room with the boxes and the letter. I knew she'd be inside. and I knew she'd be okay with letting me in. When I stepped through the door, the smell of cinnamon and coffee greeted me like an old friend. She was in the kitchen, her back to me, barefoot, and humming quietly as she stirred something on the stove. It wasn't performative. She didn't turn around with a grand smile or announce breakfast like a scene from a movie. She just kept doing what she was doing, knowing I was there, knowing I'd come to her in time. That, more than anything, told me we had crossed into something new. Not urgency, not infatuation, but something rooted. She finally glanced over her shoulder and said, "I made that oatmeal you said you hated." I smirked and leaned on the counter. "That's one way to test loyalty." "No," she said with a playful edge. "It's how you know someone loves you, when they eat your bad oatmeal anyway." I sat down, took the bowl she handed me, and took a bite. It was terrible. We both knew it. But I didn't flinch. "Best damn oatmeal I've ever had," I said. And she laughed so hard she had to wipe tears from her eyes. That laugh, real and full and unguarded, did more to anchor me to her than any confession ever could. We didn't need grand declarations. We needed mornings like this. After breakfast, we stepped out onto the finished deck. It gleamed in the early sun, each board sealed and set, strong beneath our feet. She walked the length of it with her fingers, brushing the railing, and I watched her move like someone rediscovering what it felt like to take up space. "You gave me this," she said softly, not looking at me. "You built this." "We built it," I corrected. She paused, nodding, and then turned toward the woods, staring at the tree line like she was seeing the horizon for the first time in years. "I've been thinking," she said after a long stretch of silence. "What if we hosted something here? Like a dinner. Nothing fancy, just people." I raised an eyebrow. "You want to throw a party?" "Not a party," she said. "A gathering. You, me, a few neighbors. Maybe your sister. Maybe even my daughter if I'm brave enough to call her." That surprised me. She hadn't mentioned her daughter since the first week we met, and even then it had been with guarded restraint. "That sounds like a big step," I said. "Yeah," she replied. "But maybe I'm tired of walking in circles." So we did it. Not all at once, and not without nerves, but over the course of a few days, we made plans. Cleaned up the yard, borrowed extra chairs, shopped for groceries, and even printed out a small paper invitation to hand-deliver to a handful of people she hadn't spoken to in years. She called it the deck dinner, like it was a new tradition. And maybe it would be. She made phone calls with shaking hands but held her voice steady. I watched her reintroduce herself to people who had written her off, watched her explain the event as casually as she could. No pressure, no expectations. Just dinner. The day of the gathering, the sun came out full and warm. We strung up lights across the porch, arranged chairs in a wide half-circle, and laid out mismatched plates and glassware like it was intentional charm. She wore a pale blue sundress that matched the sky and pulled her hair back in a loose braid that made her look 10 years younger. When I told her that, she rolled her eyes and said, "I'm not trying to look younger. I'm trying to look like me." I nodded. "Then you nailed it." Guests began to arrive slowly. First her old neighbor Janice, then my sister Lena and her husband, then a few locals I barely knew, but who greeted her like they were reuniting with a long-lost cousin. There was laughter and awkward small talk, and the clink of glasses and forks on plates. But more than that, there was ease, the kind of ease that only comes when people decide to stop pretending. And when, about an hour into dinner, her daughter pulled into the driveway and stepped out of the car, every voice around the table stilled. She froze on the grass, uncertain, clutching a small gift bag in both hands. I saw the breath catch in her mother's throat. But she stood anyway, walked slowly across the yard, and embraced her daughter without words. The moment was quiet, messy, imperfect, and absolutely beautiful. When they stepped back, both of them wiping tears, the circle of chairs widened to welcome her in. No one questioned it. No one needed to. That night, when the stars came out and the last of the guests trickled away, she and I stood alone on the deck, the soft twinkle of string lights above us and the sound of crickets in the dark. She turned toward me with a half-smile and said, "This isn't the life I thought I'd have at 51. "Me neither," I replied. She stepped closer, touched my chest gently with her palm and said, "But I'm glad it's the one we're building." And just like that, I knew. This wasn't about fixing a deck anymore. It never really had been. It was about what we'd built between the boards, between the silences, between the laughs and the tears and the stories and the glances. We hadn't just repaired something broken. We had created something brand new. The morning after the dinner felt different, not in the sense of change that comes with a grand revelation, but more like the subtle shift of seasons, noticeable only when you take a moment to breathe and realize the air smells new. There was a stillness in the house, but it wasn't empty. It was full in a different way now. The deck still had wine glasses scattered about, the tablecloth was stained, with laughter and red sauce, and the smell of warm bread still lingered in the air. She was already outside when I woke up, sitting cross-legged on the deck with a steaming cup of tea beside her, scribbling something down in a notebook. From the kitchen window, I watched her for a minute. The way the breeze moved through her hair, the way her eyes scanned the trees, as if they were speaking to her in a language only she understood, the way she held the pen loosely, like the page beneath her wasn't just paper, but the ground she was trying to find her footing on. I stepped outside and joined her without saying a word. We sat side by side for several long minutes before she finally looked up and said, "I think I want to write again." It was a whisper, more to herself than to me, but it carried the weight of a decision long buried under years of self-doubt and distraction. I didn't ask what she wanted to write or why she had stopped before. I just nodded and said, "Then, you should." Her eyes met mine with that mixture of hope and fear I'd seen in her before, when she'd handed me her trust for the first time like a fragile heirloom. But this time, I saw something else too. Resolve. The next week passed, like a soft rhythm one day sliding gently into the next. She cleared a corner of the spare room and turned it into a writing space. We picked out a new desk from a second-hand shop downtown. Nothing fancy, just wood and drawers and potential. I helped her carry it inside and she cleaned it with the kind of care people usually reserve for keepsakes. She started each morning at that desk, pen in hand or fingers on the keys of her old laptop, coffee beside her and the dogs lying nearby as her silent, loyal audience. Some days she barely wrote a page, others she filled 3. But it didn't matter. What mattered was the act, the motion, the returning. Meanwhile, I kept finding little things to fix around the house, the loose tile in the hallway, the old railing on the front steps, a leaky faucet in the guest bathroom. None of them were urgent, but each was another thread tying me to her space, her rhythm, her story. I knew I could have finished those tasks in a couple of days, but I stretched them out. Not because I was avoiding anything, but because I didn't want to miss a moment, and she let me. Let me stay, let me linger, let me belong. Not with words, but with the way she made extra coffee each morning, or the way she started keeping peanut butter crackers in the pantry, because she remembered I liked them. One afternoon, as I was sanding down the edge of a warped shelf in the hallway, she leaned against the doorway with her arms folded and said, "You ever think about just staying?" I didn't look up right away. I just ran the sandpaper one more time across the wood and replied, "I already am." She laughed, a quiet, startled sort of sound, and said, "I meant permanently, like not just between projects." I finally looked at her then, and I didn't have a clever answer or some poetic line. I just said, "I know," and she nodded, like that was all she needed to hear. That night, we sat out on the deck again, this time with a small fire burning in the chimenea and a blanket stretched across both our laps. She read me a paragraph she had written that day, about a woman rebuilding her life after years of silence. It was fiction, she claimed, but we both knew better. As she read, her voice wavered only once, at a line that said, "Healing is not a lightning bolt. It's the sound of a door slowly creaking open again after too many years shut." She stopped, looked at me and asked, "Too much?" I shook my head. "Just enough." When the stars came out, she asked me if I believed in fate. I told her no, that I believed in choices, in showing up, in staying when things got uncomfortable. She smiled and said, "That's even better." Then she rested her head on my shoulder and whispered, "You're the first man in 51 years who actually listens." I didn't say anything. I didn't need to, because I knew she wasn't just talking about hearing words. She meant being heard, understood, without needing to fight for it. And that kind of listening, it goes both ways. As the fire crackled, beside us I realized we were building something that didn't need blueprints or hammers. No nails, no permits, no instructions, just presence, just patience. Just the quiet act of sitting beside someone long enough for their walls to come down without force. I'd thought I was just repairing her deck, but I had been helping her rebuild something far deeper. Her sense of self, her voice, her willingness to let someone in. And in doing so, I had rebuilt parts of myself I didn't know had gone hollow. The next morning, I woke up early and started a new list of things to repair, not because they were broken, but because they mattered to her. That was the difference. Now, I wasn't just fixing things to prove something. I was fixing things because I had found someone worth showing up for again and again. And every hammer swing, every screw turned, every brush of paint was just another way of saying, "I hear you." Over the days that followed, there was a rhythm to our lives that wasn't loud or showy, but it had a heartbeat, a quiet cadence that made everything feel grounded. It was the way mornings began with the sound of a kettle whistling, the scent of cinnamon toast drifting through the hallways, and the gentle rustle of her robe as she moved from the kitchen to her writing room. I'd gotten used to the creak of the floorboard outside the guest bathroom, the squeak of the back screen door, and the groan of the porch swing as she leaned into it late in the afternoons. These weren't just sounds anymore. They were signals that the life we were slowly weaving together was real, tangible, present. I continued tinkering with things around the house, not because they were in desperate need of fixing, but because I'd grown to love the way she looked at me when I stepped back and wiped my hands on my jeans, proud of something small like a repainted cabinet or a straightened fence post. There was validation in her smile, not just of the work, but of the man doing it. She'd started reading to me more often in the evenings. Sometimes things she'd written, sometimes passages from old books she used to love but had shelved away years ago, thinking no one would care to hear them anymore. But I cared. I cared about the words and the way her voice dipped and lifted, the way her eyes would glance up now and then to see if I was still listening, and the soft relief when she realized I always was. The house itself seemed to respond to her newfound energy. The garden began to bloom a little brighter, the windows caught more sunlight, and even the old fridge stopped making that weird clicking noise as if it, too, had decided to settle into the peace that now filled the space. One Saturday afternoon, as I was repairing a section of the gutter on the side of the house, she came out wearing overalls that hadn't seen daylight in years and declared she was going to help. She grabbed a paintbrush, dipped it in the can of forest green I'd opened, and started painting the side gate without waiting for instructions. She hummed to herself as she worked, and it wasn't long before her dog, Oscar, tracked green paw prints across the gravel. We both laughed so hard I nearly spilled the ladder, and she ended up wiping a smear of paint across my cheek like a 5-year-old. There was no talk of boundaries or timelines that day, no deadlines. Just the steady unfolding of comfort and ease, the kind that only comes when people stop pretending and just exist, fully in the space they share. Later that evening, I found her at the piano in the front room, a space I'd never seen her use before. Dust still lined the top of the keys, but her fingers had made trails through it as she tested chords like an old friend revisiting a language they hadn't spoken in years. The music wasn't polished, but it was honest. I stood in the doorway and watched her until she noticed me, then sat beside her without a word. She played a melody I didn't recognize, soft, slow, and full of nostalgia, and when she finished, she said almost shyly, "I used to write songs, a long time ago, before all this." I didn't ask what all this meant because I already knew. Life, loss, settling, compromise, everything that piles up between who we are and who we meant to become. That night, she told me about the man she used to be married to. Not out of bitterness, but with the kind of detachment that comes from finally making peace with something you once tried too hard to hold on to. She talked about the ways he'd shut her down, how every time she'd share a thought, a dream, a half-finished story, he'd redirect the conversation to something more practical. How over the years, her voice had gotten smaller, her laughter less frequent, until eventually, she'd become a background character in her own home. She didn't cry when she told me that. She just looked tired. Tired, but unburdened now, like speaking it out loud had taken the final stone off her chest. And I just listened. Not because I had the right response or any wisdom to offer, but because sometimes silence is the best way to honor a truth that's taken someone years to speak. We fell asleep on the couch that night, tangled in a blanket with a movie still playing in the background. When I woke up, the credits were rolling and her head was on my shoulder, her breath slow and steady. I didn't move. I didn't want to. Because that moment, simple, quiet, completely unremarkable by the world's standards, was everything I didn't know I'd been waiting for. There were no grand declarations, no fireworks, no dramatic confessions, just warmth and peace, and the quiet knowledge that I was exactly where I was meant to be. The next morning, she handed me a mug of coffee and said, "You know, I never thought I'd find someone who didn't need me to be anyone but myself." I smiled, touched her hand, and replied, "That's the only version I ever wanted." And she nodded, like that was the most unexpected gift she'd received in years. From that point forward, there was a shift in how we moved around each other. Less cautious, more assured. We didn't need to define what we were building. We just kept building it, one moment at a time. And maybe that's the point of this whole thing. Maybe love, especially later in life, isn't about grand gestures or whirlwind romances. Maybe it's about being seen, really seen for who you are, and having someone stay, not despite it, but because of it. As autumn edged its way into the valley, the air grew crisp, and the leaves around the deck I had first repaired began to rustle with a dry whisper, their green fading into shades of amber and rust. The light in the house shifted too. It came through the windows at a slant, gentler and more golden, like the sun itself had softened to match the quiet bloom of something that had taken root between us. The days had grown shorter, but somehow, the time felt longer, stretched by the warmth of small rituals we had created. Morning tea on the porch wrapped in mismatched blankets, shared glances across the kitchen as she stirred soup and I chopped vegetables, and the soft cadence of our conversations that no longer needed filling with anything but presence. There was a tranquility that lived in those silences now. Not an awkward void, but a knowing one, where words had become optional, and comfort filled the space instead. She had started wearing color again, bright reds and purples, like she was reclaiming something she didn't even know had been stolen from her years ago. I noticed it first in a scarf, then in a cardigan, and then in the deep blue of a dress she wore to a small neighborhood dinner party. We had walked there hand in hand, not saying much, but the gentle pressure of her fingers around mine was enough to keep the cool wind at bay. I'd never been a man who enjoyed small talk or dinner parties, but that night I found myself watching her move through the room, laughing with ease, her presence like a soft light guiding others into comfort. She looked like someone who had grown whole again, not because someone saved her, but because she finally had room to be all the parts she had once tucked away. Later that night, after the last dish had been washed, and the neighbors had trickled back to their homes, she stood by the window and said something that stopped me in my tracks. I used to think being alone was better than pretending I was happy. But now, I don't feel alone even when you're not in the room. She didn't look at me when she said it. She just spoke it into the stillness, and I stood behind her, letting the weight of that sentence settle around us. I could have said something poetic or profound in return, but I didn't. I just wrapped my arms around her waist and rested my chin on her shoulder. Sometimes the best answer is simply staying. That night, we sat by the fireplace, the glow of the flames painting her face in warm hues. She told me more about her childhood, the mother who taught her how to make soup from scratch, the father who died too young and left a hole in the family no one ever quite filled. She shared memories that were soft and others that were jagged, and I held them all like sacred things, listening not just with my ears but with the kind of attention that says, "I'm still here." I told her about the house I grew up in, about my brother who passed away when we were teenagers, and how that grief had taught me to fix things not just with my hands, but with intention. We didn't trade wounds for sympathy. We shared them as proof that we had survived and grown. The days rolled on with the kind of quiet certainty I had never trusted before. I wasn't used to stability. In my past, things that felt good were often fleeting, or conditional, or based on some unspoken expectation that would eventually collapse under its own weight. But this was different. She never needed me to be anyone but myself. She didn't want promises wrapped in grand gestures. She wanted reliability, presence, authenticity, and in return, she gave me the kind of steadiness I hadn't even realized I was craving. We fell into the rhythm of shared tasks, painting the porch rails together, organizing the attic, writing down recipes she hadn't touched in years. Each project was a collaboration, not because they needed to be done, but because we enjoyed the process of doing them together. And somewhere in all that togetherness, I stopped thinking about what came next. I had always been a man who planned, who looked down the road and tried to predict the curves. But with her, the future wasn't a looming question mark. It was simply an extension of the now. It was the next walk through the orchard, the next meal we'd cook together, the next soft moment when we'd look up and realize the day had slipped away without urgency or noise. I found myself writing again, something I hadn't done since college. Just small thoughts, poems, fragments of memories. She encouraged it, even left me an old notebook she used to keep, its first pages yellowed and fragile. I filled it slowly, without pressure. It became a record of everything I was feeling, but couldn't always say out loud. One afternoon, while we were sitting on the back porch watching Oscar chase falling leaves, she turned to me and asked, "What would you have done if you hadn't stopped here that day?" I didn't answer immediately. I thought about it, really thought about it. Then I said, I probably would have gone on like I was, fixing things for strangers, never staying long enough to matter. But now I can't imagine not being here. She nodded, and for the first time, I saw her eyes well up, not from sadness, but from being seen. She reached out, squeezed my hand, and said, "You're the first man in 51 years who actually listens." It wasn't meant to be profound, but it hit me like a wave. Because I knew what it meant to go unseen, to be present but not acknowledged, to offer your thoughts or feelings and have them dismissed like clutter. That moment crystallized something in me. Love isn't just about the grand moments, it's about the quiet ones. The ones where you make eye contact and stay, where you hear someone's story without trying to fix it, where your presence says, "You matter." That kind of love doesn't shout, it whispers, it stays. And for the first time in a long time, I knew that staying wasn't just something I could do. It was something I wanted, fully and freely. The mornings had taken on a rhythm that soothed something ancient in me, like an old ache finally given a place to rest. I would rise with the sun, slip on the same flannel jacket she always said made me look reliably rugged, and brew the coffee while the sky slowly exchanged stars for light. Sometimes she joined me before the kettle even whistled, her hair, still messy from sleep, wrapped in the same thick robe she wore the first morning I arrived, back when I was just the guy fixing her deck. Now, I was more than that. I was the one who stayed, the one who asked her how she slept and really meant it, the one who listened to her stories without checking my phone or pretending interest. And somehow, over the weeks, that small act, listening, had reshaped the edges of both our lives. We didn't talk about the future in grand, sweeping terms, but there was an unspoken understanding that we were moving through time together now, not separately. There was a sacredness to our shared spaces, to the smell of cinnamon in her kitchen, to the way she let her hand rest on mine when we sat quietly on the porch in the evenings, as if anchoring herself in the present. One afternoon, I was sanding down the old banister on the back steps when I heard her humming from the garden, a tune I couldn't name but had grown used to, like the background music of a peaceful home. She was pulling weeds in her wide-brimmed hat, talking softly to the tomatoes as if they could hear her. I paused my work to watch her for a moment. There was a joy in her movements that wasn't performative. It wasn't for show. It was the quiet contentment of someone who'd finally found peace in the mundane. She caught me staring and waved a gloved hand at me. "Don't let me distract you," she teased. But I could tell she liked being watched, liked being noticed. I smiled and went back to work, the sandpaper hissing across the wood, the rhythm of it matching the rise and fall of her humming. It was in those little, unnoticed moments that love deepened, when no one was performing, when no one needed to be rescued, when the world simply felt right. That evening, we sat on the swing she'd had installed last summer but rarely used, before I came along. It creaked softly beneath us, the wood warm from the sun. She leaned her head on my shoulder and said, "I used to think I was too much for most men. Too opinionated, too independent, too loud when I was passionate and too quiet when I was sad. But you never asked me to be less of anything." I didn't know what to say at first. Her words caught me somewhere between awe and sadness. I wanted to tell her that she was just the right amount of everything, that her fire never burned too hot, and her silence never felt like withdrawal. That being with her wasn't about managing her energy but basking in it. So I said what felt truest in that moment. "You're easy to be around when I stop trying to be someone I'm not." She looked up at me then, eyes shining with something that wasn't tears but close, an emotion so big it couldn't quite fit inside a label. Later that week, she showed me a drawer in her bedroom filled with letters. Some unsent, some returned, most unopened. "These are pieces of me I used to hide," she said, running her fingers across envelopes yellowed with age. Little attempts at connection I never had the courage to follow through with, or that people never answered. She laughed softly. "I used to think maybe I was just bad at love." I took her hand in mine and said, "Or maybe you were just waiting for the right audience." We spent that night reading some of them together, her voice trembling through certain passages, steadier through others. Some were written to past lovers, others to her younger self. One was addressed to "The Man Who Will Finally See Me." She didn't read that one aloud. She just handed it to me. I read it in silence, my chest tightening with every line. It was a letter full of hope and fear, of longing and self-doubt. But mostly it was a declaration of worth. It said, "I know I am hard to love sometimes, but I'm still worth it." When I finished, I folded it back into the envelope and kissed the top of her head. "You're more than worth it," I whispered. And she squeezed my hand like she was afraid to let go of the moment. The days started to blend, not in a monotonous way, but like pages of a novel that flowed seamlessly, each scene a continuation of a larger story. We found new things to share. A puzzle we kept going on the coffee table, crossword battles where she almost always beat me, and old records we played in the evening, dancing slowly in the living room like no one was watching. Once, while dusting the bookshelves, she pulled down a framed photo I hadn't seen before, her wedding picture from decades ago. She stared at it for a long time, then turned to me and said, "He was a good man once, but somewhere along the way, we both forgot how to care properly." I didn't press for more. I just took the photo, placed it in a box with other memories she wasn't ready to display, and said, "You don't have to apologize for your past. It led you here." She looked at me then, not with regret but with gratitude, and I understood that healing isn't about erasing what came before. It's about integrating it, honoring it, and then gently moving forward. One chilly night, as we were bringing in firewood, she paused on the back steps and looked up at the stars. "I used to come out here alone," she said, breath fogging, in the cold. "Sometimes just to cry, sometimes just to feel something." She looked at me. "Now I come out here with you, and it doesn't feel lonely anymore." I didn't respond with words. I just wrapped an arm around her and held her close, letting the silence say everything. We stood there for a long time, two figures wrapped in the quiet hum of contentment, the kind that doesn't ask for more, but still welcomes it. That night, I wrote in my journal, "She doesn't complete me. She mirrors me." And in that reflection, I see the version of myself I like most. The air had taken on that late autumn sharpness, the kind that whispered of approaching frost, but still carried the golden hue of afternoon light. Leaves clung stubbornly to the trees, turning every shade of fire, amber, rust, and deep burgundy, as if nature was holding its breath before letting go. She had taken to wearing one of my flannel shirts around the house, rolled sleeves and all, and every time I saw her in it, I couldn't help but feel like something inside me was being gently rewired. That day, we were reorganizing the shed, a project she'd been meaning to tackle for years, according to her. The space had become a graveyard for half-used paint cans, brittle garden hoses, and forgotten furniture draped in drop cloths. We spent hours, side by side, her humming some old tune under her breath while I swept out cobwebs and cataloged tools that hadn't seen the light of day since the Clinton administration. At one point, she pulled out a dusty picnic basket, laughed, and said, "I used to dream of someone taking me on a surprise lunch under the trees with this thing. It's ridiculous, right?" I shook my head and simply said, "Not ridiculous. Just waiting for the right day." That evening, I packed that very basket with sandwiches and a thermos of soup, and we sat beneath the old oak on the far side of her property. No grand speeches, no big declarations, just the sound of wind, the crunch of leaves, and two people who were no longer pretending to be strangers to each other. A few days later, she took me to her favorite little antique store in town. It wasn't fancy or curated like those big city boutiques. It was cluttered, chaotic, and beautiful in the way only time-worn places could be. "This is where I come when I need to remember who I am," she said as she ran her fingers across a stack of old record sleeves. I watched her as she moved through the aisles, touching everything gently, reverently, like the objects held more than history. They held her own memories. She picked up a small ceramic bird, turned it over in her hand, and said, "My mother had one just like this on the windowsill above the sink. I used to think it was watching me, judging me." I smiled and said, "Maybe it was just lonely too." She blinked, then laughed. "Maybe you're right." We left the store with nothing purchased but something deeply restored. That night, she fell asleep on the couch next to me while a black and white film flickered on the screen. I didn't wake her. I just watched her breathe, realizing that the quiet presence of someone beside you could sometimes speak louder than any promise. As the season deepened, we settled into a rhythm that felt more like living than anything else I'd known in years. We weren't trying to impress each other anymore. We weren't waiting for the next big moment. We were just in it, fully, humbly, and completely. There were days when we didn't speak much, where the silence wrapped around us like a blanket, warm and unthreatening. There were nights when we couldn't stop talking, reliving stories from our younger years or imagining what we'd do if we suddenly won the lottery. Her answer always included restoring an old theater. Mine usually involved building a cabin in the woods. We made lists of dreams we thought were too late to chase and then circled the ones we'd try anyway. And slowly, something unexpected started to grow. Not just love, but a sense of belonging. Not just romance, but partnership. And in that space, the ache of our pasts began to soften, but not everything was without friction. There was a morning when she snapped at me over something trivial, the way I loaded the dishwasher, of all things. Her voice was sharp, uncharacteristically so, and it caught me off guard. I didn't respond in kind, just stood there, letting the sting of her words settle. A few minutes later, she came back into the kitchen, her face drawn tight with apology. "I don't know why I did that," she said quietly. "Sometimes I get scared that this won't last, and instead of saying that, I get mean." I walked over, touched her cheek, and said, "Say scared next time. I can hold scared. Mean is harder." She nodded, tears slipping down her face. We held each other for a long time, right there by the sink, surrounded by soap bubbles and silence. That moment didn't undo the sting of her words, but it made space for grace, and that, more than perfection, was what we were learning to practice. One night, as we sat by the fire pit wrapped in the same quilt, she whispered, "Do you ever think it's too late for people like us?" I didn't pretend not to know what she meant. "Too late for what?" I asked. "For starting over, for falling in love in a way that lasts this time." I looked at her, really looked at her. The crinkles near her eyes, the calloused fingers from years of living. the softness that came from finally being safe enough to be vulnerable, and said, "Not too late, just right on time." She didn't respond with words. She just leaned into me, and we watched the flames together as if they were telling us the story we didn't know how to finish yet. In the distance, an owl called, and somewhere inside me, the last remnants of loneliness finally let go. The first snow came softly, like the world was exhaling in white. I had woken early that morning to the familiar creak of the cabin floor beneath my boots, the faint smell of coffee wafting from the kitchen, and the odd silence that came with snowfall, like the earth had decided to mute itself for just a little while. Through the frosted windows, the trees stood still, branches dusted like powdered sugar, and the porch held tiny footprints where a stray cat had passed through in the night. She was still asleep when I slipped outside, bundled in my coat, just watching the flakes fall like time had slowed down for once. I don't know what it was about that moment that hit me. The peace of it, maybe, or the beauty in such quiet. But I knew I didn't want to experience it without her again. Not just mornings like that, but everything. Arguments, shared soup, movies we paused too much during, her scattered books across the living room, and her habit of half-humming old jazz standards when she didn't realize it. It all felt like home, not just the place, but her. Later that morning, we lit a fire and she wrapped herself in that thick gray shawl she always wore on cold days. Her hair was pulled back loosely, a few silver strands catching the light. I couldn't help but stare. She caught me and raised an eyebrow. "What?" she said, sipping from her mug. "You're looking at me like I've got snow on my face." I shook my head slowly, then said, "You ever just realize you're looking at the rest of your life?" She blinked, smiled, and said nothing. But she set her mug down, walked over, and kissed my forehead, lingering there like she didn't want to move either. That was the thing with her. She didn't need words to say everything. We spent the next few days snowed in, not by any emergency, but just enough weather to make staying home the better option. We played cards by candlelight when the power flickered, baked cookies with whatever ingredients we had left in the pantry, and danced, yes, actually danced, to an old Christmas album playing from her ancient CD player. She told me stories about the years she used to decorate for every holiday, even when she lived alone, just to make the space feel less empty. I told her about how I used to hate the holidays because they reminded me of what I didn't have, and then, without either of us saying it aloud, we realized this was the first time in a long time that December didn't feel cold. It felt like something was being restored. Not something new, exactly, but something we'd both thought we had missed out on. One evening, during one of those quiet winter nights where the whole house glowed in firelight, she sat across from me cross-legged on the couch, reading. She looked up and said, "You know, I used to think I was a hard woman to love." I set down my book and asked her why. She shrugged. "Because I've got opinions, because I'm not 25, because I like space sometimes and I've built a life I don't want to give up." I leaned forward and said, "You don't need to give it up. You just let someone into it." She looked at me like that was the first time anyone had ever said that to her. "And you don't think I'm too set in my ways?" I smiled. "I think your ways are the exact reason I'm still here." That same night, as we stood side by side brushing our teeth, an ordinary moment that somehow felt sacred, she glanced at me in the mirror and said, "You know what scares me?" I paused, toothpaste still foaming in my mouth, and mumbled, "What?" She spit, rinsed, then looked me dead in the eyes and said, "That I'll mess this up. That something this good won't last because I'm afraid to believe it's real." I wiped my face with a towel, walked over, and gently took her hands. "You won't mess it up," I said. "You've spent 51 years learning how to survive. This is just the part where you learn how to live." She didn't say anything back, but the way her shoulders dropped, like a weight had been lifted, told me everything I needed to know. Around that time, she found an old photo album buried in a box labeled "Someday." We spent hours flipping through it. Pictures of her as a child, with wild curly hair and missing teeth, standing next to a Christmas tree twice her size. Pictures of her teenage years, all long legs and oversized sweaters, grinning next to friends she hadn't spoken to in decades. And then pictures of her adult life, some with family, some alone, some with that sadness in the eyes that comes when life doesn't quite meet you halfway. She paused at one of her younger self in a kitchen, apron on, laughing at something, just out of frame. "That girl thought she'd have it all figured out by now," she said. I rested my hand on her back and replied, "That girl grew into a woman who finally stopped trying to figure it out and started living it." That night, I couldn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling, replaying everything in my mind. The years before her, the chance encounter that brought me to her kitchen, and every moment since that had slowly stitched us together. It wasn't some grand romantic movie. It wasn't all fireworks and violins. It was better. It was real. A deep breath after years of holding it in. The kind of connection that doesn't announce itself loudly, but roots quietly into your bones. I turned toward her in the dark, watching her chest rise and fall, and I whispered, "Thank you," even though she couldn't hear it. "Thank you for the second chance, for the soft landing, for being proof that it's never too late." The next morning, I made breakfast before she woke up. Nothing fancy, just scrambled eggs, toast, and coffee. But I placed a small yellow flower from the windowsill planter on her napkin. When she came into the kitchen and saw it, she blinked, then laughed softly. "What's this?" I shrugged. "A reminder that you're worth small, beautiful things, every single day." She looked at me for a long time, eyes glossy but not quite teary, and said, "You're the first man in 51 years who actually listens." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just walked over and held her. And in that embrace, in that morning light, I felt something shift. Not just in her, but in me too. A quiet agreement that whatever came next, we'd face it together. The snow melted slower than usual that year, lingering around the edges of the yard like winter wasn't quite ready to let go. But beneath the frosted soil, you could sense something, waking up. The first crocuses poked their heads through in the flower beds she swore would never bloom again, and the birds had begun to return with their chaotic morning symphonies. Spring was early, subtle, but it was here. And with it came something else. A decision we both knew had been tiptoeing around the corners of our days for months. It wasn't about rings or vows or signing legal papers. It was about the idea of forever. The idea that maybe this connection we stumbled into was bigger than just warm companionship or emotional recovery. That maybe it was love, the kind that doesn't demand, doesn't rush, but simply endures. We started working on the house again, not because it needed it, but because it gave us something to share. She had this idea of building a greenhouse, behind the deck, one she'd been dreaming of since her 20s. She showed me sketches she had drawn years ago. Notes scribbled in the margins of gardening magazines she kept tucked inside old cookbooks. And so, we made it happen. One weekend at a time. She planted tomatoes with more care than I'd seen in any contractor laying foundation. And I watched her from the side, hammering wood and holding glass panes in place, wondering how many things in her life she'd given up on before someone came along and said, "Yes, let's do it." In between the days of manual labor and slow breakfasts, we had conversations that dug deeper than either of us expected. She told me about her father, a man who never raised his voice, but whose silence could freeze a room. About the first man, who told her she was too much, and the second who told her she was not enough. About the year she almost moved to Italy just to disappear, and the night she decided to stay instead. I told her about my younger brother, who I hadn't spoken to in 6 years. About the motorcycle accident that left me with a fear of speed and a respect for stillness. About the first time I realized love could be peaceful and terrifying at the same time. Each time we peeled another layer back, it felt less like storytelling and more like remembering something together. Like we were rewriting both our histories with a softer pen. One rainy afternoon, she found a letter in a drawer while looking for batteries. It was from her ex-husband, dated 5 years ago. The handwriting was neat, almost too formal. It wasn't an apology, just a recounting of memories and a vague request for forgiveness, wrapped in poetic language. She held it for a long time before folding it again and tossing it into the fire without a word. The paper curled, blackened, and disappeared, and she exhaled like she had just released a decade from her lungs. I used to think closure had to come from them, she said. Turns out, it comes from me. I didn't say anything. I just reached out and took her hand, letting her squeeze mine like an anchor. The silence between us was louder than any sentence could have been. There were still hard days, of course. Moments when the shadows of the past would sneak in through the windows and settle in the corners. Sometimes I'd catch her staring off mid-conversation, lost in a memory or a fear she hadn't voiced yet. Other times, I'd feel myself withdrawing, out of habit more than anything else. We were two people learning how to exist together after a lifetime of learning how to be alone. But every time the walls creaked, we stayed. We sat through the discomfort, held each other when words wouldn't come, and reminded ourselves that love doesn't mean perfection, it means choosing. Every single day. Around that time, her sister came to visit. A surprise visit, she said, though the anxious way she glanced around the place made me think it was more of a check-in. Her name was Marie, sharper than her older sister, a little quicker to judge. She didn't say much the first night, just observed. The next morning, over coffee, she finally asked, "So what are you two exactly?" My partner looked at her calmly and said, "We're figuring it out." Marie narrowed her eyes. "At your age?" And I'll never forget what she said next. "Especially at our age. Because now we actually know what matters." There was nothing smug or defensive in her tone, just quiet certainty. Marie didn't press the topic again. That afternoon, while Marie walked the property alone, we sat in the kitchen and laughed about the awkwardness of it all. "You know," she said, "I used to envy her. The way she always had a plan, a direction, a husband, even if he wasn't right. Meanwhile, I was just here, collecting books and fixing broken drawers." I looked at her then, really looked, and said, "Maybe she had the map, but you built the shelter." She blinked, and for a moment, tears welled in her eyes, though she quickly brushed them away. "You're too good at this," she whispered. "I'm not used to someone who actually sees me." I reached across the table and placed my hand over hers. "Well, get used to it. I'm not going anywhere." Few days later, after Marie left, we sat on the porch wrapped in blankets, watching the sun sink behind the pines. She leaned into me and said, "You know, I've never had a man sit through my silence before." I turned my head slightly and kissed the top of hers. "Then I guess I'll have to keep doing it." The stars began to appear, one by one, and we stayed out there until the chill forced us back inside. But something stayed with us that night. A kind of soft understanding that we were no longer two people hoping not to be alone. We were partners. Whatever label that came with didn't matter. What mattered was that every morning she poured 2 cups of coffee instead of 1. That every evening we reached for each other without even thinking. That every part of this, life, from deck repairs to gardening to the quiet hum of a shared space, had become more than routine. It had become sacred. The morning air felt heavier than usual, thick with an emotion neither of us knew how to name, but both of us had grown used to carrying. I stepped out onto the deck and found her there, the same spot she always stood in when she wanted space but not distance. She was barefoot, a mug in hand, staring out over the garden that had begun to change colors with the early signs of fall. The light painted soft golden hues across her silver-streaked hair, and for a moment, the ache in my chest returned. Not the painful kind, but the kind you get when you're looking at something you know is finite and precious. We hadn't spoken much since the night she told me about her past. About the years she had buried her voice just to keep the peace. About the way she had convinced herself that silence was safer than confrontation. That night had left something unspoken between us, like a door slightly ajar, and neither of us had tried to close it since. I stood next to her and didn't say a word. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone who has spent a lifetime being unheard is to simply stand beside them in silence. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but firm, the kind that had found its strength through 1,000 shattered pieces. "You ever think about what you would have missed if you'd taken a different job that week?" she asked. I nodded. "Every day." She sipped her coffee, her lips twitching into a faint smile. "I used to think I'd already lived all the chapters that mattered. She turned to look at me, eyes soft. And then you showed up with a toolbox and a calm voice, and the whole story changed. I didn't know how to respond to that without sounding like I was trying too hard, so I just touched her hand, gently, like punctuation at the end of a sentence that didn't need fixing. Inside the house, the scent of cinnamon and baked apples drifted through the air, and for a second, it didn't feel like a place we were temporarily trying out. It felt like home. Later that day, we found ourselves back on the deck, sitting, on the steps, knees brushing, sharing pieces of stories we hadn't yet told. I told her about the time I almost quit carpentry altogether after losing a friend on a job site. She told me about her first marriage, how she spent 6 years waiting for him to notice her haircuts or the way she stopped smiling. Every story peeled back another layer until we weren't just two people who had met through a broken deck. We were a pair of human histories slowly learning how to intertwine without tangling. She asked me if I thought people were meant to have just one great love in their life, and I told her I wasn't sure. But I do know, I said, that sometimes the second chapter is where the real story starts. She nodded, eyes glassy, and leaned her head against my shoulder. Thank you, she whispered. Not for the deck, not for the repairs, but for listening. For staying. For hearing her in the quiet. That night, the wind picked up and carried a chill through the open windows. I added another log to the fireplace and noticed how natural it felt to move around her house as if I had always belonged. She was curled up on the couch, blanket tucked under her chin, cheeks flushed from the warmth. I watched her drift off to sleep, the lines on her face softening, her breathing slowing. There was something so profoundly right about the stillness, the peace that blanketed the room, the way time seemed to slow down when I was near her. And in that stillness, I made a decision, not with words, not even with intention, but with presence. I stayed, not because she needed me, not because I had nowhere else to go, but because there, in that room filled with the hum of life finally finding its rhythm, I realized I wasn't fixing someone else's broken world anymore. I was building a new one with her. The days unfolded into a rhythm that didn't require discussion, like two dancers who knew the steps without ever rehearsing. I'd wake early, make the coffee, and she'd be out in the garden with her gloves on, pulling weeds or humming to her hydrangeas. I started taking fewer jobs, not out of laziness, but because for the first time in my life, I realized not every hour needed to be traded for money. Some hours were meant to be lived, to be shared, to be held gently like something sacred. We began little traditions, the kind that sneak up on you and wrap themselves around your heart before you even realize they've taken root. Sunday morning pancakes where she'd pretend not to notice I always burned the first one. Tuesday night walks where we said everything and nothing as the sun went down. She showed me her old recipe cards, handwritten and stained with time, and I made it my mission to cook through every one of them, even if half the time the smoke alarm screamed in protest. She laughed more now, the kind of laugh that started in her chest and rose like a bird set free. And every time she laughed, I felt like I'd built something stronger than a deck. I'd rebuilt a piece of her that the world had weathered for too long. But even in peace, the past finds ways to knock on your door. One afternoon, while I was restaining the deckboards, she came out holding a letter, hands shaking slightly. It was from her ex-husband. The words were clinical, calculated, and laced with the kind of false humility that men use when they're not sorry but want to look like they are. He'd heard about me, she said, wanted to reconnect. Maybe even stop by. I saw the way her shoulders tensed, the old fear creeping back in, the muscle memory of bracing for emotional impact. I didn't tell her what to do. I just stood beside her, handed her a pen and said, "Whatever you write, make sure. It sounds like your voice, not the one he made smaller, but the one that found its way back." She didn't write him back. She burned the letter in the fire pit that evening and sat beside me without speaking. And in that silence, she told me more than any words could have. That night, I looked at her and realized something terrifying in its clarity. I wasn't falling in love with her anymore. I already had. It wasn't a dramatic moment. There was no sweeping soundtrack, no cinematic backdrop. Just her in her bathrobe, tying up her hair, muttering about how she was finally getting her favorite bookshelf organized. And I thought, this This is the life I never knew I wanted until it stood in front of me barefoot and unfiltered. I started seeing the world through the lens of permanence. Not in a possessive way, but in the sense that when you finally find something good, something gentle, something earned, you want to protect it without caging it. She'd ask me sometimes if I ever got bored of her stories. I'd smile and tell her that her stories weren't just entertainment. They were blueprints to the person I loved most in the world. One morning, as we sat on the edge of the bed, with the window open and the breeze dancing through the curtains, she said, "I never thought I'd love someone again without apology." I took her hand and said, "You don't owe anyone an apology for surviving, least of all me." And that's how we built it. Not fast, not flashy, but brick by brick, word by word, with patience, kindness, and the understanding that sometimes the strongest homes are the ones you build after the storm has passed. It's strange how something so soft could feel so solid. That's how she felt to me, solid. Like no matter how much the world had tried to hollow her out, she had filled the cracks with gold and stood taller because of it. Her laugh had weight. Her silence had meaning. Every moment we shared felt like it had roots. She wasn't a puzzle piece I had found. She was the picture on the box I'd been trying to assemble all my life. And over time, without either of us marking the exact date, her home became mine too. I kept my tools in the shed now, not the back of my truck. My toothbrush lived beside hers, and I didn't flinch when she moved things around in the kitchen. Anymore. There were no more exit plans, no more mental footnotes like, "just until this job is done." I wasn't the man fixing a deck anymore. I was the man fixing a future, one small kindness at a time. She liked to joke that we were too old for fairy tales. But I'd counter that fairy tales are for people who need to believe in magic, and we had something better. We had effort. We had mornings where she made the tea and I made the eggs. And that was enough. We had arguments that never tried to win, only tried to understand. We had memories that weren't centered on big dates or grand gestures, but on things like how she'd rest her head on my shoulder at the farmer's market when the crowd got too loud, or how I'd instinctively reach for her hand during the last few steps of our evening walk. And it wasn't just us. Somehow, in this little world we'd created, we started gathering others too. Her neighbors, once distant and polite, started stopping by more often. A boy from down the street would bring over his puppy, and we'd teach it how not to bark at delivery trucks. A retired music teacher from 2 houses over would sit on our porch every Thursday evening and play her violin while we drank wine and watched the sun go down. Our home became a haven, not because it was fancy or filled with expensive things. It wasn't. The couch was still too firm, and the faucet in the guest bathroom had a slow drip we hadn't gotten around to fixing. But it was filled with life, with warmth, with the kind of love that doesn't show up like fireworks, but rather glows steady like candlelight. One late afternoon, I found her in the garden with dirt on her cheeks and a half-planted row of tulips in front of her. She looked up at me, squinting, against the sun, and said, "Do you think we'll still be doing this when we're 70? I told her I hoped so, that I wanted nothing more than to be here, knees creaking, backs aching, hands still reaching for hers through it all, and she smiled, wiped her forehead, and said, "Well, then I guess I better plant something that takes its time." The seasons changed, and with them came new routines. We started hosting small dinners. Nothing fancy, just a few friends, some mismatched plates, and laughter that spilled onto the patio like music. I'd catch her looking at me sometimes when no one else was paying attention. That soft smile curling at the corners of her lips like she still couldn't quite believe I stayed. And the truth is, neither could I. Not because I didn't want to, but because for so long I'd trained myself to keep moving. I'd lived my life in projects, not permanence. But with her, I learned to stay, to be still, to plant roots. One winter morning, while frost still clung to the windows, I woke to find her staring out at the snow. She looked peaceful, like the silence outside had wrapped itself around her. I asked what she was thinking, and she said, "I think I finally feel like I'm allowed to be loved." That stayed with me, because somewhere in her past, someone had made her believe she needed permission. And now, through every small act, every meal, every walk, every time I held her hand without asking, I was giving her that permission back. Not because she needed it from me, but because she needed to be reminded that love doesn't require conditions. It just asks that you show up. The final piece of our story didn't come with some big climax. There was no dramatic proposal, no sweeping declarations under starlight. It came one evening as we sat on the porch swing, the sun bleeding pink and orange across the sky, her hand wrapped in mine, and her head on my shoulder. She sighed and said, "I used to think no one listened. Not really. But you've always heard me." And I realized in that moment that the most powerful thing I'd ever done wasn't rebuilding her deck. It was listening. Listening without fixing, without advising, without trying to shape her into anything she wasn't. Just listening and letting her be whole. A few months later, we held a quiet gathering. No invitations, just word of mouth. The garden was blooming, and the air carried that early summer hum. She wore a dress the color of deep wine, and I wore the same boots I'd shown up in the day I met her. We didn't say vows. We didn't need to. Everyone who came already knew what we had built together. We just stood together in front of our community, the little family we had formed without even realizing it, and shared a toast. No rings, no paperwork, just a promise spoken in a glance, sealed with a kiss, and backed by every slow, intentional day we'd spent building a life. Now every morning, I wake up to the sound of her humming in the kitchen. I walk out, wrap my arms around her, and she still smells like lavender and lemon. We sip coffee and read the paper, sometimes in silence, sometimes in shared commentary about things neither of us plan to change, but love to complain about. We tend to the garden. We fix what breaks. We laugh about things only we find funny. And every once in a while, she'll look up from her book or her pruning shears and say, "You're still listening." And I'll nod. Because I always am. We didn't find each other in the flush of youth or the haze of infatuation. We found each other later, after the noise had died down, after life had handed out its bruises. And in that quiet, we built something louder than any argument, stronger than any storm. We built a home, a real one, not with walls and beams, but with trust, laughter, and time. A place where listening wasn't just an act, it was the foundation. And so, if anyone ever asks how I ended up staying with a woman who looked at me across a half-finished deck and said, "You're the first man in 51 years who actually listens," I'll tell them this. I stayed because she deserved to be heard. I stayed because I was tired of rushing and ready to rest. I stayed because sometimes love doesn't shout. Sometimes it just sits beside you in the garden and hands you another seed to plant. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.